Vote drink up, Evelyn. It's special for you. Cheryl's voice was sweet, almost too sweet, as she set the pale pink glass in front of me, with a voicemail from Dad. The rim glistened with sugar, a mint leaf floating lazily on the surface. I could smell the sharp tang of cranberry under the perfume she wore, floral heavy. When my phone's with a voicemail from Dad, suffocating, the dining room felt smaller than it was. Heat from the fireplace pressed against my back, while the November wind rattled the window panes. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Around the table, silverware clinked against plates, laughter rising in pockets, but my focus was on that glass. I had felt this before. With a voicemail from Dad, the sudden fatigue after last month's dinner, the dizzy spell in the parking lot, the way my hands trembled for no reason. And always, with a voicemail from Dad, Sheryl was the one who handed me my drink. Loretta, her mother, sat 2 seats away, gold bangles sliding on her wrist as she talked. Her voice was loud, with a voicemail from Dad, the kind that filled a room whether you wanted it to or not. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, she never missed a chance to remind me Aaron had married up. Sheryl turned to fetch a linen napkin from the sideboard. My heart knocked hard against my ribs. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I glanced at the second glass on the counter, identical in shape, color, garnish. Without thinking, I reached over. I voiced with a voicemail from Dad, fingers steady despite the surge of adrenaline, and switched them. The swap took less than 5 seconds. When Sheryl returned, she placed the napkin at my elbow, her eyes scanning my face. "Go ahead. Try it," she said. I smiled. "I will, dear." Conversation ebbed and flowed, but I kept my hands in my lap. With a voicemail from Dad, I could hear the grandfather clock in the hall, a slow, steady tick that seemed louder than it should. The drink sat before me untouched. Wistaman, voicemail ad busman, its pink surface catching the flicker of candlelight. Across the table, Loretta took a sip from her glass. She grimaced slightly, then forced a smile, with a voicemail from Dad. Minutes later, she reached for her water, a sheen of sweat appearing at her hairline. Cheryl's laughter faltered. From Dad, her gaze flicked from Loretta to me and back again. "Mom, are you okay?" Loretta waved her off at first. "Dad, just warm in here." But I saw her fingers grip the tablecloth, knuckles white. The room's energy shifted. Aaron stopped mid-sentence. Someone dropped a fork. Piv buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. It clattered against the china. The smell of rosemary and roasted lamb hung thick in the air. Loretta coughed, then coughed again, harder. From Dad, "I think I need to sit outside." She managed, but her voice was thin, reedy. Sheryl stood so fast her chair tipped. "Call someone?" she shouted. With a voicemail from Dad. I remained in my seat, one hand lightly resting on the untouched cocktail. My pulse had slowed, not quickened. I watched as Aaron fumbled for his phone, unbuzzed with a voicemail from Dad. As the younger cousins were shooed into the living room, within minutes the front door opened to the cold night air, and paramedics stepped in. From Dad, their jackets rustling, the scent of antiseptic cutting through the roast and wine. "What happened?" one asked. Sheryl was frantic, her voice high-pitched. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, she just started feeling sick. The medic's eyes landed on the 2 glasses still on the table. "Dad, which one was hers?" I lifted my free hand and pointed. "That one," I said. She brought it for me. A silence followed, heavy and deliberate. With a voicemail from Dad, Cheryl's eyes darted to mine, wide and searching, but I didn't look away. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Forping light when found buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the shuffled paramedics moving Loretta onto a stretcher. When the door closed behind them, the warmth from the fire seemed to drain from the room. With a voicemail from Dad, Aaron stared at me, but I kept my gaze on the flickering candles. "Evelyn," he began, but his voice broke. He didn't finish. I picked up my water. With a voicemail from Dad, I took a slow sip and set it down. "Let's finish dinner," I said softly. In that moment, I knew this wasn't over. The glass was evidence. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, my instincts had been right, and whatever game Sheryl had been playing, she now knew I was willing to play too, only by different rules. The night stretched on. What if I was with a voicemail from Dad? Conversation forced, plates half-eaten, but inside, my thoughts were sharp, deliberate. This was no longer about avoiding trouble. This was about ending it. When my phone buzzed with voicemail fronting on my terms, and I wasn't done, I hadn't always felt like a stranger in my own family. There was a time when Sunday dinners were mine to plan, with a voicemail from Dad, mine to fill with the smells and sounds that said, "You belong here." I used to roll out pie dough on the oak table, its surface dusted with flour, with a voicemail from Dad. Aaron leaning against the counter as a boy, stealing bits of apple filling when he thought I wasn't looking. Back then, Leon buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The windows were steamed from the heat of the oven, not rattling from November wind. Back then, laughter came easy. When my phone voicemail from Ford, I can still see the first Christmas after Frank and I bought the lake house. Snow had piled high against the porch rail. Voicemail from Dad. And Aaron, barely 12, was out there with a shovel too big for his arms. I slipped on my red wool coat, grabbed my own shovel, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and we cleared a path together, breath puffing in white clouds. Inside, Frank had a pot of chili simmering, and Bing Crosby sang from the old radio. A voicemail from Dad. It felt like a life we could keep forever. Even after Frank passed, I kept that rhythm. Birthdays, Thanksgivings, little milestones. Aaron would call with a voicemail from Dad, "Can we do it at your place?" And I'd say yes, every time. I gave him more than just meals. I co-signed the loan for his restaurant. With a voicemail from Dad, pulled from my savings to cover payroll when business was slow. I didn't keep a ledger. I didn't need to. Family doesn't charge interest. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, then Sheryl arrived. At first, I told myself she was just different. She liked things polished, precise. The first Thanksgiving she attended. Then when my phone voicemail from Dad, she walked into my kitchen, looked at the pie cooling on the counter, and said, "Oh, you still make your own crust." Not mean, exactly, but not kind either. With a voicemail from Dad, I laughed it off, told myself I was being sensitive. But the changes came small and steady. One year, with a voicemail from Dad, Thanksgiving moved to their place. Because it's easier. Another year, I was asked to just bring bread instead of the turkey. Mav buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Family photos began without me because we didn't want to bother you, Evelyn. You looked tired. The tired part wasn't wrong. With a voicemail from Dad, I had been feeling it. Headaches, waves of dizziness that came and went without pattern. Always after dinners Sheryl hosted. I told myself it was the wine. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, maybe my age catching up. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Still, I kept showing up. I thought being present was enough to keep the connection alive. I thought wrong. Last month's dinner was my first real warning. A pale cocktail in a tall glass, with a buzz with a voicemail from Dad, handed to me by Sheryl with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. An hour later, I was clutching the railing in the parking lot, the world tilting. For a buzz with a voicemail from Dad, Sheryl offered to drive me home, said maybe I shouldn't be alone so much. Her tone was light, but her eyes, calculating. That night, with a voicemail from Dad, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the throb in my temples, the taste of bitterness on my tongue. I didn't tell Aaron. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, part of me didn't want to believe it, and part of me was afraid of what he'd say if he did believe it. Now, in the echo after tonight's chaos, with a voicemail from Dad, my mind kept slipping back, through the warm years, through Frank's steady voice telling me to trust my instincts, through my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, through the moments I chose not to see the pattern. The fire popped in the hearth, but the warmth didn't reach me. The house felt like someone else's. Buzzes with a voicemail from Dad. Aaron avoided my gaze as if I needed anything. I shook my head. No, dear. I'm fine. It was the same lie I'd been telling for months. I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. When the last plate was cleared, I stepped into the hallway away from the low murmur of voices. The grandfather clock ticked, buzzes with a voicemail from Dad, each second a reminder that time was running out for pretending. I could smell Cheryl's perfume lingering in the air, a heavy floral, with a voicemail from Dad, clinging to the fabric of the evening. I thought about the lake house, about the title deed tucked away in my bedroom drawer, formally when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, about the years I'd spent building a life where my son would feel secure, and about the way that security could be turned in the wrong hands. With a voicemail from Dad into a trap for me, I pressed my palm to the cool wood of the hallway table, steadying myself. In my mind, I could hear Frank's voice, with a voicemail from Dad. What clear as the day we signed the mortgagee. Don't let anyone take this from you, Evie. Not ever. In that moment, with a voicemail from Dad, I understood the shape of what was happening. This wasn't just unkindness. It was a narrowing of my world, piece by piece, with a voicemail from Dad, until I had nowhere left to stand but where they put me. Not yet, I told myself. Not tonight. Tonight I'd smile. I'd thank them for dinner. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I'd leave with my coat buttoned against the wind. But I wouldn't forget the way Cheryl's eyes had widened when I pointed to that glass. With a voicemail from Dad, the memory of her surprise would keep me warm on the cold walk to my car. and the certainty building in my chest would carry me through whatever came next. Cuzzed with a voicemail from Dad, because this wasn't over. Not even close. Saturday mornings at Hartwell's table used to make me proud. The clink of coffee cup, the hum of conversation. Whipping might when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the smell of bacon curling up from the griddle. It was Aaron's dream, and I'd done what I could to make it real. I still came in from time to time, with a voicemail from Dad. Not to meddle, but to feel part of something I'd helped build. That morning, the late winter sun poured through the front windows, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, casting long rectangles of gold across the tiled floor. Aaron was at the register, hair mussed from the breakfast rush. Sheryl stood beside him. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, sleek in a cream blouse, greeting customers with that polished smile of hers. Loretta was perched at a corner table, a mug of tea in front of her. Voicemail from Dad, bracelet stacked on both wrists. I stepped in, pulling my coat tighter against the leftover chill. A few of the regulars nodded. Mrs. What with a voicemail from Dad, Callahan from the florist wave. I smiled back. For a moment, it felt like old times. Aaron spotted me. Morning, Mom, he said, his voice warm but quick. Then a voicemail from Dad, as if afraid to linger. Sheryl's smile flickered. You didn't tell me you were coming, she said. Well, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. We're pretty full. I'll just sit at the counter, I replied, hanging my coat on the stand. Don't worry about me. I slid onto a stool. When a phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the vinyl cool against my legs. The young waitress, new face, poured me coffee, steam curling up into my face. I wrapped my hands around the mug. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, letting the heat sink into my fingers, Sheryl's voice carried light but pitched just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Dad. Mum, she called across the room. Do you have cash to cover your breakfast? The till's tight today. The words hung there, sharp and deliberate. Dad. A few customers glanced up from their plates. My ears burned. I have my purse, I said evenly. She tilted her head, smile still fixed. Good. With a voicemail from Dad. We don't do tabs anymore. Keeps things tidy. The implication landed like a stone in my chest. She might as well have said I was a freeloader. Loretta laughed. A dry, knowing sound. Best to set boundaries, dear. Family or not. And Aaron muttered something to Sheryl, too low for me to catch, with a voicemail from Dad. But he didn't look at me. I sipped my coffee, tasting more bitterness than brew. My mind flicked through every payroll I'd helped cover, with a voicemail from Dad. Every supply bill I'd paid without asking for repayment. But I kept my face still. A man at the end of the counter glanced my way, eyes sympathetic, and buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I straightened my shoulders, met his gaze, then looked back at Sheryl. I wouldn't want to upset your system, I said. Cut my buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Put my breakfast on my bill. The room went quiet enough that the scrape of a fork on a plate sounded like a bell. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Sheryl's smile faltered for just a moment, but she recovered, turning to greet a new couple at the door. I finished my coffee in silence. When my phone buzzed to mail from Dad, the waitress brought my plate 2 egg bacon toast, and I ate slowly, aware of Loretta's eyes on me from her corner. Each bite was mechanical, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Each chew an effort to swallow the heat rising in my throat. When I was done, I left a 20 under the mug and slid off the stool, with a voicemail from Dad. My coat felt heavier than it had when I came in. As I reached the door, Loretta called out, her tone sugary. Don't forget your change, Evelyn. Was sipping my lat when my phone buzzed with a voicemail. Dad and lit the place out. Though, at a couple near the window chuckled, though they quickly looked away when I turned. I smiled, small, controlled. Keep it, I said. Consider it an investment. Loretta's brows lifted. Sheryl's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Aaron kept his eyes down. With a voicemail from Dad, I stepped outside into the bright, cold air, the door closing behind me with a soft thud. The street smelled of melting snow and diesel from a passing truck. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from my dad, walk into my car, I let the air clear my head. My heart was steady, but something inside had shifted. If this was how they wanted to play, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, then I needed to change my game. Through the restaurant window, I could see Sheryl watching me leave, her expression unreadable. My keys were cold in my hand. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but I gripped them tight, because I knew the next move wasn't hers. It was mine. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with my name typed neatly in the center. It was with a voicemail from Dad. Aaron slid it across the kitchen table, his hand lingering on the edge as if to keep me from pushing it back. Sheryl stood by the counter, arms crossed. Smell of funner that the faint smell of her perfume carrying across the room. What's this? I asked. Just some updates, Aaron said. Bank paperwork. Voicemail from Dad, it'll make things easier for all of us. We easier. The word landed wrong. I brushed my fingertips over the envelope. The paper was smooth. From Dad, expensive. The kind used for wedding invitations or legal notices. My stomach tightened. Sheryl poured herself coffee, with a voicemail from Dad, the cup clinking a little too loudly in the silence. It's just a power of attorney, Evelyn. You know? It's man from Dad. In something happens? In case something happens? I repeated. She smiled, but her eyes didn't soften. You're not getting younger, with a voicemail from Dad. We need to be ready. The November light slanted through the window, pale and cold. Outside, the wind rattled the last of the oak leaves against the siding when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Inside, the only sound was the slow tick of the clock on the wall. I opened the envelope. Inside were several stapled pages, the legal language dense and heavy. From Dad. My name appeared in bold at the top, followed by Aaron's and Sheryl's as authorized agents. My pulse thudded in my ears. From Dad? Why is Sheryl on here? In case I'm not available, Aaron said quickly. I turned to the second page. Paragraphs of clauses scrolled past my eyes. Dad, but one line snagged my attention, including, but not limited to, the withdrawal, transfer from Dad, or disposal of funds from any personal or joint accounts. My throat went dry. Dad, this gives you full access to my accounts. It's standard, Sheryl said, her tone flat. Every family does it. I set the pages down, with a voicemail from Dad aligning them neatly. And when did we decide I needed someone to manage my money? Aaron rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, Forte, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail, Dad, we're not saying you can't handle it. We just don't want you stressed. I thought of the restaurant payroll I'd covered, with a voicemail from Dad. The house repairs I'd paid for, the countless loans that were never repaid. Not once had they offered to take over the stress then. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, my gaze drifted to the sideboard where a stack of unopened mail sat. I rose, crossed the room, and pulled my latest bank statement from the pile. The voicemail from Dad, the numbers glared up at me. My balance was lower than it should have been. Much lower. Did you withdraw from my account? I asked. Aaron's eyes flicked to Sheryl. We used some funds for the restaurant, he said. Just to cover a gap. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. You weren't using it. The air in the room thickened. You didn't ask. We thought you'd say no, Sheryl said, as if that justified it. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I stared at them. The son I'd raised, the woman he'd married, standing in my kitchen explaining away theft as convenience. With a voicemail from Dad, my hands were steady as I folded the papers and slid them back into the envelope. I'll think about it. Sheryl's mouth tightened. There's with a voicemail from Dad. There's nothing to think about. I met her gaze. That's where you're wrong. Aaron reached for my arm. Mom? I stepped back with a voicemail. Dad. If you needed help, you should have asked. Not taken. The clock's tick grew louder. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, at each second marking the distance between the life I thought I had and the one I was staring at now, I set the envelope on the counter, walked to the door, from den and pulled on my coat. The fabric was cold against my skin. My keys jingled in my hand. Where are you going? Aaron asked. For air, I said, with a voicemail from Dad. And to think, the wind hit me as soon as I stepped outside, sharp and bracing. I welcomed it. In the distance, the lake shimmered under a weak sun. The white earth blessed with a voicemail from Dad, the water restless against the shore. My breath came slow, deliberate. They had crossed a line, and they thought I would step over it with them. Not now. This, voicemail from Dad ever. Behind me, through the kitchen window, Sheryl was watching, her arms still folded. I didn't look away. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, if they thought the envelope was the end of the conversation, they were wrong. It was the beginning. The silence came first. Not the kind that's peaceful, fortifund of voicemail from, like when the lake holds its breath before dawn, but the hollow kind, the kind that echoes in your own chest. The phone stopped ringing, with a voicemail from Dad. Texts trickled down to nothing. Even the junk mail felt thinner. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. People get busy, schedules shift. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but then I saw the photos. They were on Sheryl's social media. Aaron's birthday at the restaurant, the table lined with candles and cake. I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, Loretta the center beaming, Sheryl with her arm looped through Aaron's, Tommy in the background smiling for the camera, my chair. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the one I always took near the window empty. I stared at the screen until the image blurred. My coffee had gone cold beside me. My phone buzzed in the voicemail from Dad, the bitter scent rising like something burnt. I set the mug down and walked to the front window. Outside, frost rimmed the grass, was with a voicemail from Dad, the pale light of December struggling to warm anything. By the time Christmas rolled around, the message was clear. I hadn't been invited, with a voicemail from Dad, not forgotten, excluded. The space where my presence used to be was now filled by someone else. The lake house felt larger than it ever had. With a voicemail from Dad, my footsteps seemed to travel too far before landing. The hum of the refrigerator was the only constant sound. When Mound buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I found myself turning on the TV just to hear voices, leaving the kitchen radio playing long after I'd stopped listening. Even the neighbors noticed. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, Callahan from the florist stopped me on the sidewalk one morning, her scarf pulled tight against the wind. "Dad, haven't seen you at the market lately," she said. "Been staying in." I replied. Her eyes softened. "You should come by, we miss you." I smiled, laping my lat when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. But the truth sat heavy. I didn't want to be seen alone. The only crack in the wall they were building around me was Tommy. He'd text now and then. Little things, haiku, grandma, or I saw a fox by the lake. Sometimes he'd stop by after school with a voicemail from Dad saying he was in the neighborhood, though I knew he'd come out of his way. One Thursday afternoon, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. He knocked with a bag of pastries from the bakery downtown. "Mom doesn't know I'm here," he said, grinning. I set out plates, with a voicemail from Dad. "Then we'll keep it between us?" We ate at the kitchen table, crumbs scattering across the wood. He told me about a science project, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad about his friend's new puppy. I listened, storing every word like it was more valuable than money, because in a way it was. When he left, with from Dad, the house fell back into its quiet. I washed the plates by hand, the water hot enough to sting. With a voicemail from Dad, my reflection in the kitchen window looked older than I remembered. Lines deeper, eyes shadowed. January came, and with it, a deeper cold. With a voicemail from Dad, it ice-crusted the lake's edges. I bundled in my wool coat for walks, the wind slicing through the gaps in my scarf. Out here, with a voicemail from Dad, the world was stripped down to essentials: gray sky, white ground, the crunch of my boots. One afternoon, I passed the restaurant. Through the steamed-up windows, with a voicemail from Dad, I saw Aaron and Sheryl laughing with a group at the front table. Loretta was there too, bracelets flashing as she waved her hands in a story. When the false with a voicemail from for Dad, I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, the cold biting my cheeks. No one looked up. I kept walking. At night, I'd sit by the fire, form light when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from that, the warmth pressing against my front while my back felt chilled. My mind wandered to the papers Aaron had given me, still tucked in the drawer by the phone, with a voicemail from Dad, the bank statement, the withdrawals. The way Sheryl's tone had shifted when I refused to sign. This wasn't just neglect. It was a pattern. Squeeze me out. The finds with a voicemail Dad'd make me seem incapable, then take control. The isolation worked in small ways. "A missed call here. Must have forgotten to tell you." There. Friends from buds would mention events I'd never heard about. With a voicemail from Dad, even the church committee I'd served on for years began meeting without me. To keep things simple. One evening, as I was stacking firewood inside, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The phone rang. It was Aaron. "We're having a little get-together at the restaurant next week," he said, with a voicemail from Dad. "Thought you might want to come." I almost said yes out of sheer hunger for company, but something in his voice, careful, measured, made me pause. "Dad, what's the occasion?" "Just friends and family," he said. "It'd be nice to see you." Sheryl's voice murmured something in the background. 41 my phone voicemail from Dad, 4 foot too faint to make out. I knew then this wasn't about reconciling. It was about control. If they were inviting me, there was a reason, and it wasn't kindness. Voicemail from Dad. I agreed anyway. After we hung up, I stood by the window, watching the moonlight lay silver across the frozen lake. My breath fogged the glass. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, if they thought isolation would make me pliable, they'd miscalculated. I'd learned to live alone before. I could do it again. With a voicemail from Dad. But something told me the get-together wasn't going to be friendly. It would be a stage and I would be the target. The cold outside deepened, Porpy, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but I didn't move from the window, because now I wasn't just bracing for their next move. I was waiting for it. The restaurant looked different at night. Amber light spilled from the windows onto the icy sidewalk, steam curling up against the glass. Inside, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the low hum of conversation was threaded with bursts of laughter. I stood outside for a moment, the cold seeping through my coat, my reflection faint in the pain. Buzz and buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. If they wanted me here, it was for a reason and not one I'd enjoy. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me. With a voicemail from Dad, heavy with the scent of seared beef and garlic butter. The tables were full, waiters weaving between chairs with trays balanced high. Aaron spotted me first, but a voicemail from Dad, moving toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mom," he said, kissing my cheek quickly, with a voicemail from Dad. "Glad you could make it." Sheryl appeared at his shoulder, dressed in black silk that shimmered under the lights. "We saved you a seat," she said, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Her tone as smooth as the wine she held, her lipstick was perfect, her eyes sharp. The table was long, pushed together from several smaller ones. Voicemail from Dad. At the center sat Loretta, bracelets catching the light as she gestured, a glass of red wine in hand. Around her, a mix of friends, relatives. Divided buzz with a voicemail from Dad. I didn't recognize. I took the empty seat near the far end. The chair was slightly lower than the others. A buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and I had to look up to meet anyone's eyes. A small thing, but not an accident. The noise swelled and broke around me, clinking glasses, bursts of laughter. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from, our plates arrived, steaming and fragrant. My plate, when it came, was missing the side dish everyone else had. The waitress, cheeks flushed, apologized quickly. We must have run out." I smiled and said nothing. Aaron stood to make a toast. "To family, friends," with a voicemail from Dad. "And the ones who make it all possible." Would everyone raise their glasses? I lifted my water, feeling Cheryl's gaze slide over me. I'd buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. "And to those who've given more than they could afford," she added. "Even if they don't always remember it." Laughter bubbled down the table. With the voicemail from Dad, too quick, too knowing. My chest tightened, the heat from the room pressing against my skin. I kept my smile steady. As the night wore on, bus with a voicemail from Dad. The digs became less subtle. "You should try the salmon, Evelyn," Loretta said loudly. "It's light, easy on the digestion." Sheryl chimed in. "From Dad. Or maybe just dessert. Less to chew." I heard the soft snickers, the clink of forks against porcelain. My water glass was empty. Buzzed up with a voicemail from Dad, and no one offered to refill it. I reached for the pitcher myself, the cold condensation slipping against my fingers. Halfway through the meal, Sheryl leaned in. With a voicemail from Dad, her voice pitched just enough to carry. "We were talking earlier about the house, Evelyn. If it's too much for you to manage," with a voicemail from Dad, "we'd be happy to take it off your hands." Loretta added, "It's a shame to let such a place go downhill." The words landed like stones in a still pond, wowzed with a voicemail from Dad. Ripples pushing out to every ear at the table. I felt them, watching me, measuring, judging, waiting to see if I'd break. I set my fork down. From Dad, its metal ringing faintly against the plate. "The house is fine," I said. "Better than fine." Cheryl's smile didn't move, but her eyes hardened. From Dad, "Well, if you change your mind." Dessert came. Plates of tiramisu, cheesecake, creme brulee, except for me. A single scoop of plain ice cream, with a voicemail from Dad, already melting, slid in front of me. The cold sweat on the bowl mirrored the damp on my palms. I picked up my spoon, took one slow bite, and set it down, with a voicemail from Dad. Around me, conversation swirled, the clinking of glasses covering the undercurrent of something meaner. Then came the final push. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Sheryl tapped her glass with a spoon, the sharp chime pulling the room's attention. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she said, for a voicemail from Dad, standing, "and to share some news. Aaron and I will be expanding the restaurant." Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, "It's all thanks to the generosity of family." A murmur of approval swept the table. She turned, her smile widening, "Particularly Evelyn." Voicemail from Dad, "Who's been so kind with her contributions." The word hung in the air. Not generosity, not support. Contributions. With a voicemail from Dad, like I was a nameless donor at a charity event. A few people clapped. Others just looked at me curious. Heat flushed up my neck. I rose slowly. From Dad, my chair scraping against the floor. I'm glad my help has been useful, I said. My voice was steady, calm. With a voicemail from Dad. And I'm sure it always will be. Cheryl's smile faltered, just for a moment. I stepped away from the table, toward the coat rack near the door, with a voicemail from Dad. As I reached for my coat, my eyes landed on the small security camera mounted above the bar, its lens pointed directly at the table. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the corner of my mouth lifted. If the restaurant kept footage, and I knew they did, every word of tonight was on record. Every insult, with a voicemail from Dad. Every moment they tried to turn me into a punchline. I slipped my arms into my coat and buttoned it slowly, with a voicemail from Dad. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said, and walked out into the cold. The night air was sharp, clean. My breath puffed white against the dark, with a voicemail from Dad. My boots crunching over a thin layer of snow. Behind me, the restaurant's light spilled onto the sidewalk, but it didn't reach me. I pulled my collar up, with a voicemail from Dad. My mind already working, they'd given me something tonight, more than they realized, and I planned to use it. The morning after the dinner, with a voicemail from Dad, the restaurant's laughter still rang in my ears, sharp and false. I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope from Aaron beside my coffee. Outside, the lake was with a voicemail from Dad. The lake was frozen solid, the surface pale under a thin winter sun. I traced the edge of the envelope with one finger, then pushed it aside. If I wanted answers, with a voicemail from Dad, I needed to stop guessing. I dressed in my navy wool coat, pulled on gloves, and stepped into the brittle cold, with a voicemail from Dad. The wind cut across my cheeks as I walked to the car. The engine grumbled in protest before catching, the air from the vents smelling faintly of dust. From Dad, the bank sat on the corner of Main and Fifth, its glass doors smudged from a morning rush. Inside, the heat was dry, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The air smelling faintly of copier toner and fresh coffee from a pot somewhere behind the teller counter. A Christmas wreath still hung lopsided on the wall. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dalladay. A young teller in a crisp blouse smiled at me. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Oh, I need to review my account history," I said, with a voicemail from Dad setting my ID on the counter. "And I'd like a printout of any joint accounts under my name." Her fingers tapped quickly across the keyboard, with a voicemail from Dad. "Do you have your account number?" I handed over my worn leather checkbook. She flipped it open, entered the digits, gushed with a voicemail from Dad, and her smile dimmed just slightly as she scanned the screen. "I'll print that for you," she said, disappearing into the back. I stood by the counter. Lone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the muffled sound of a printer whirring beyond the wall. A man in a heavy parka shifted behind me, the scent of cigarette smoke clinging to his coat. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The clock on the far wall ticked slow and steady. The teller returned with a stack of papers. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. "Here's your primary account activity for the past 12 months, and these are records of joint accounts." "Joint accounts," I repeated. From Dad. She hesitated, glancing toward the manager's office.
"Yes, 2 of them."
I took the papers, the edges crisp under my gloves. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. "Could you print the authorization forms for those accounts as well?" Or her lips pressed together. A voicemail from Dad. "I'll need the branch manager for that." The manager, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, came over. "Is there an issue, Mrs.?" With a voicemail from Dad. "Hartwell, I'd like copies of any documents showing my signature on these accounts," I said, sliding the papers toward him. A voicemail from Dad. "Especially this one." I tapped the second joint account, opened last March. He took them, scanning the page. The voicemail from Dad. "Give me a moment." While he was gone, I flipped through the account activity. The numbers hit me in cold waves, withdrawals of $5,000 and here, $30,200 there. When the voice would a voicemail from Dad, each labeled business expense or miscellaneous transfer. Dates lined up uncomfortably close to the times Aaron had mentioned. Tight weeks. At the restaurant, a voicemail from Dad. The manager returned with 3 photocopied forms. "These are the signatures on file." I looked at them. My name was there. Voicemail from Dad, an handwriting that mimicked mine, but leaned too far right, the loops uneven. My stomach tightened. "This isn't my signature," I said. My phone voicemail from Dad. The manager's brow furrowed. "You didn't authorize these accounts?" "No," I said flatly. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, "and I didn't authorize these withdrawals." He shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Hartwell, we take forgery seriously." With a voicemail from Dad. "If you'd like to file a fraud report." "Not yet," I interrupted. Could you date stamp these copies for me? All of them? He hesitated with a voicemail, from then nodded. Of course. As the stamp thudded against paper, I slid the documents into my bag. My pulse was steady, almost too steady. Mine would have the voicemail from Dad. It reminded me of my nursing days, when the only way to keep your hands from shaking during a crisis was to keep them moving. When I stepped outside, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, where the air felt sharper, I walked to the car slowly, each step deliberate. Across the street, a delivery truck idled, the driver watching me with idle curiosity. With a voicemail from Dad, I got in, started the engine, and sat for a moment, the heater clicking on. I pulled the papers from my bag and spread them across the passenger seat. Voicemail from Dad. The forged signature seemed to stare back at me, daring me to call it what it was. Forgery. Theft, betrayal, written in black ink. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I thought of Sheryl's hand on my shoulder at the dinner. When my phone buzzed with mail from Dad, her voice dripping with gratitude for my contributions. Of Aaron's eyes sliding away when I asked about the withdrawals. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and of the security camera above the bar quietly recording. They'd been careful, but not careful enough. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, tucking them back into my bag. The car smelled faintly of the cinnamon tea bag I'd left in the cup holder last week, with a voicemail from Dad. I wrapped my fingers around the steering wheel, feeling the grain of the leather under my gloves. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. Forward when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Evidence was power, and I wasn't done collecting. As I pulled away from the curb, the sun caught on the frost clinging to the bare branches, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, making them glitter like glass. The road stretched ahead, pale under the winter light. I had the proof I needed. Now I just had to decide how to use it. With a voicemail from Dad. The house felt larger at night. I lay in bed, eyes open to the dark, the ceiling faintly lit by the winter moon slipping through the curtains. With a voicemail from Dad. The lake was silent, frozen under a thin crust of ice. Every sound inside seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the tick of the hallway clock, the occasional sigh of the old wood frame settling. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the papers from the bank. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The slanted loops of a signature that wasn't mine. The manager's careful tone when he asked if I wanted to file a report. With a voicemail from Dad. The way my stomach had dropped as the dates and withdrawals lined up in my head. I pushed back the covers and swung my legs to the floor. With a voicemail from Dad. The hardwood was cold under my feet. Downstairs, I lit the fire in the living room, the crackle of kindling catching quickly. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The smell of wood smoke curled into the air, warm and familiar. On the mantel, Frank's photo caught the firelight, him on the dock in summer, hair windblown. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Eyes squinting against the sun, I stood there for a moment, remembering his voice. He'd had a way of making advice sound like an observation, never a lecture. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Never sign anything you haven't read twice, he'd said once, when a salesman tried to pressure us into a home repair contract. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. And never let anyone else decide what you're worth. I sank into the old armchair, the cushions molded to my shape after years of use. With a voicemail from Dad. My hands wrapped around the mug of tea I'd brought from the kitchen, chamomile, steeped until the steam faded. With a voicemail from Dad. The warmth seeped into my palms but did nothing to calm the restless energy twisting through me. They'd planned this. Not in a single day. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. But in careful testing boundaries, seeing how much they could take without resistance. The tight weeks? At the restaurant? The missing invitations. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the slow erasing of my place in the family until I was an outsider looking in. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I thought of the security camera at the restaurant, quietly watching while Sheryl toasted to my contributions. If the footage still existed, I was sipping my latte when my phone buzzed from Dad. What could be another piece in the puzzle? Upstairs, the wind rattled the bedroom window. I closed my eyes and pictured the sequence: review all accounts. Cut off and Dad would secure property titles, collect physical proof. Quietly, no raised voices, no early confrontations, not yet. I sipped the tea, now lukewarm, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The taste slightly bitter. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind was sharp, each thought slotting into place like a chess move. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I wasn't just thinking about defending what was mine. I was thinking about the moment they'd realize I'd turned the board. With a voicemail from Dad. The room smelled of smoke and dried pine from the firewood stacked by the hearth. Shadows shifted across the walls as the flames moved. A folder searched for a voicemail that I glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m., and still felt no pull towards sleep. Frank would have told me to act, not stew. You don't win by wishing, he'd say. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, you win by moving when they're looking somewhere else. I rose and went to the desk in the corner, pulling open the drawers. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Inside was the folder with my deed to the house, insurance documents, and a few old tax returns. I spread them out on the desk. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, running my fingers over the embossed county seal on the deed, solid proof of ownership dated long before Sheryl had even met Aaron. In another drawer, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I found the small leather-bound notebook where I kept passwords and account numbers. I flipped through, checking each one against the papers from the bank. Voicemail Dad, and no mismatches yet. But I wrote down the joint accounts and circled them in red. The night wore on. At 40:12, a voicemail from Dad. I heard the faint buzz of my phone on the kitchen counter. A message from Tommy. Just 2 words? You okay? I typed back, yes? Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Go back to sleep. But the corner of my mouth lifted. He didn't have to check in. He chose to. I returned to the armchair, pulling the quilt over my legs. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the fire was dying down, embers glowing faintly in the grate. My eyes burned from the hours awake, but my thoughts felt settled into something like resolve. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I wouldn't confront them tomorrow, or the next day. That's what they'd expect, to corner me into anger, to make me look irrational.
No, I'd wait.
When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I'd gather every scrap of proof, every record, every word I could use, and when the moment came, wouldn't be shouting across a table. It would be quiet, with a voicemail from Dad, precise. Final, the clock ticked toward dawn. Outside, the first pale light touched the edge of the lake, turning the ice to silver. No bust of a voicemail from Dad. I drained the last of my tea and set the mug aside. It was time to move from sleepless to deliberate. Time to start building the plan they'd never see coming. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I waited 3 days before making my first move. On the 4th morning, I left the house early, the lake still wrapped in fog. Rust with a voicemail from Dad. Frost crunched under my boots as I crossed the driveway. The cold had a bite that reached straight to my lungs. West with a voicemail from Dad. I started the car and let the heater run while I brushed ice from the windshield. My first stop was the bank. Inside, the branch was quiet, with a voicemail from Dad. The air carrying the faint scent of floor polish and brewed coffee. Only 2 tellers were on duty. I asked for the manager, and within minutes, Mr. With a voicemail from Dad, Callahan appeared to smooth his tie as he walked toward me. Mrs. Hartwell? He said, offering a practiced smile. How can I help? In your office. The blad. For it, please. I replied. The blinds in his small office were half closed, stripes of winter light slanting across the desk. With a voicemail from Dad. A framed photo of his family sat in the corner, the glass slightly dusty. I placed my leather notebook on the desk and slid out the forged account forms. I'd like these accounts frozen, I said, effective immediately. He hesitated. That will alert the other account holders. I know, I said, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and I want copies of all statements from the day each account was opened. He tapped his pen against the desk. We can arrange that, with a voicemail from Dad, but I must advise, I'm aware of the process. I interrupted. I also want to remove all online transfer access from my primary accounts. In person, transactions only. His brows rose slightly, but he made notes. I'll have our senior teller prepare the paperwork. As he left, when the buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I glanced toward the open office door. A man in a gray suit stood at the counter, talking to one of the tellers. With a voicemail from Dad, his voice carried just for me to catch the name, Sheryl, in the middle of his sentence. When he turned, I recognized him, not from the bank, with a voicemail from Dad, but from the restaurant. He'd been at the far end of the table during the dinner. I filed the detail away. From the bank, with a voicemail from Dad, I drove across town to a small law office on Pine Street. The building was brick, the entryway narrow and lined with old legal directories. The receptionist, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, a woman with silver hair and rimless glasses, greeted me with a warmth that didn't feel forced. You must be Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. From Dad? Grayson will see you now, Dad. His office smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Shelves lined the walls heavy with casebooks. He rose from behind his desk, with a voicemail from Dad, offering his hand. "It's been a while since I saw Frank," he said. "He was a good man." "He'd have liked this office," I replied, taking a seat, with a voicemail from Dad. We spoke for over an hour. I explained the forged accounts, the withdrawals, the attempted power of attorney. He listened without interrupting. Voicemail of Dad meant making notes in a blocky handwriting. "You have a solid case," he said finally. "The combination of financial records, forged signatures, with a voicemail from Dad and witness accounts, especially if that dinner was recorded, could support both a civil and criminal action." "I'm not ready for court," I said. "Not yet. Then we focus on securing your assets," he said. "Write title anything you own solely in your name, review your will." When I'm wanting buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and remove any loopholes they could exploit, he gave me a list: banks to contact, records to request, property protections to file with the county clerk. Forwarding my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I folded it and slipped it into my bag. By noon, I was back at the house. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar from the fire I'd lit the night before. With a voicemail from Dad, I went straight to the desk and pulled the property deed, insurance documents, and my will. I placed them in a manila envelope, sealed it with a voicemail a voice bed, and set it on the hall table. That afternoon, I drove to the self-storage facility on the edge of town. The unit was small but clean, fifth with a voicemail from Dad, smelling faintly of concrete and cold metal. I locked the envelope in a fireproof box and slid it onto the back shelf. When I left from Dad, the sky was lowering into gray. The wind had picked up, carrying the sharp scent of snow. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck. Over the next week, with a voicemail from Dad, I made my withdrawals from the restaurant's emergency fund, automatic deposit, stopping them quietly with no announcement. With a voicemail from Dad, the change would show up on their end soon enough, but by then I planned to be further along. I also began recording calls. Each time Aaron or Sheryl phoned, with a voicemail from Dad, I let the device run. Most of the conversations were brief, requests for money, casual questions about the house, but their tone was changing. Less warmth. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, more edge. On Thursday, I returned to the bank to collect the frozen account statements. The senior teller handed me a sealed envelope, her hands moving quickly, Brenda almost nervously. As I stepped into the lobby, I saw him again, the man in the gray suit. This time he was leaning against the counter, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, speaking to the same teller as before. He looked up, met my eyes, and smiled faintly before turning back to her. Something in that smile made the air feel colder, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I walked to the car, the envelope tucked under my arm. Inside, the heater hummed, but I didn't turn it on. I broke the seal and began scanning the statements. When my phone buzzed with a transaction from Dad. Most of the transactions were for predictable restaurant suppliers' payroll, but a handful were direct transfers to a personal account under the name G. From Dad Mercer. I didn't know the name. Until I did. It came back in a flash. The dinner, Sheryl introducing a longtime friend from her early catering days, with a voicemail from Dad, a man with a slicked back haircut and a gray suit. The same man now standing in the bank. The paper crackled in my hands. This wasn't just carelessness. Buzz with a voicemail from Dad. It was coordination. And I just found the thread to pull. The day I chose was a Thursday. Snow had fallen overnight, softening the edges of the world. With a voicemail from Dad, the lake was white, the trees rimmed in frost, and the air so still it felt like the whole town was holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, with a voicemail from Dad, brewed a pot of coffee, and stood at the kitchen window while it dripped, the smell rich and grounding. By 8, I was at Mr. Grayson's office. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, he had everything ready, the updated deed filings, the fraud reports, and the notarized letters removing Aaron and Sheryl from any financial authority. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the stack of documents was heavy in my bag, their weight a quiet reassurance. "You're certain you want to do this all today?" he asked. "Dad." His pen paused above the final form. "Yes," I said. "If I give them time to adjust, they'll find another angle." I nodded once, signed, with a voicemail from Dad, and slid the paper toward me. The ink was still drying when I slipped it into the folder. From there, I drove straight to the bank. Mr. With a voicemail from Dad, Callahan was waiting in his office, the blinds open to the bright snow glare. "The accounts have been frozen," he said, "and the transfers to G. Mercer are documented." "Good," I replied. "Today, I'd like to close the restaurant's emergency fund account." With a voicemail from Dad, Issue a cashier's check in my name. His eyebrows twitched, but he didn't argue. As the printer spat out the final statement, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The paper smelled faintly of warm toner. He handed me the check, and I slipped it into my coat pocket. Before leaving, I made one last stop at the security desk, with a voicemail from Dad. The young technician behind the counter brought up the restaurant's camera archives, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. With a buzzed a voicemail, Dad, do you have of the night of December 14th? He clicked, and there it was. The dinner, the toasts, Cheryl's smirk, my untouched glass, every word. With a voicemail from Dad captured in crisp audio, he saved the file to a flash drive, sealed it in a small envelope, and slid it to me. By noon, I had everything. With photographs with a voicemail from Dad. The snow was starting to melt in the midday sun, leaving damp patches on the sidewalks. I sat in the car outside the restaurant for a moment, with a voicemail from Dad, watching the front door open and close as customers came and went. Inside, the warmth was immediate, carrying the familiar scent of rosemary and baking bread. With a voicemail from Dad. The lunch crowd was thinning, and a few tables sat empty near the back. Aaron was at the bar, flipping through a stack of receipts. Sheryl stood beside him, fired a glass of wine in her hand despite the early hour. Mom, Aaron said when he saw me. Voice with a voicemail from Dad. This is a surprise. I won't take much of your time, I said, sliding into a bar stool. Cheryl's smile was tight. Dad, we've been meaning to call you. I'm sure, I said, laying the manila folder on the bar. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I thought I'd save you the trouble. I opened it slowly, letting the papers fan out, bank statements with forged signatures, the transfer records to G, with a voicemail from Dad. Mercer, the security footage stills from the dinner. Aaron's eyes darted over the pages. Cheryl's face stayed still, with a voicemail from Dad, but her knuckles white around the stem of her glass. These, I said, tapping the signatures. Her, not mine. These. I pointed to the transfers, her theft. My phone buzzed with a voice drawl from Dad. And this? I slid the flash drive forward. Is every word you said about my contributions that night. Cheryl's lips parted, but no sound came. With a voicemail, Dad. I've filed fraud reports. I continued. The accounts are frozen. As of this morning, you have no access to my finances, the emergency fund or the house. Aaron's voice was low. You went to a lawyer. Yes, I said. I went to a lawyer, and the bank, and the county clerk, with a voicemail from Dad. Every move you thought you made quietly is now on record. The Sheryl set down her glass, the sound sharp against the wood, with a voicemail from Dad. You can't just... I can, I said, my tone still even. And I have? The bartender, sensing the tension, moved down to the far end of the bar. A voice with a voicemail from Dad. A couple at a nearby table had gone silent, their forks paused midair. Aaron rubbed his forehead. Voicemail from Dad. You didn't have to do it this way. You left me no other way, I said. For a moment, no one spoke. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The only sound was the low hum of the cooler behind the bar. Finally, I gathered the papers back into the folder. I'll leave you copies, I said, with a voicemail from Dad, sliding a smaller envelope across the bar. For your records. Sheryl didn't touch it. I stood, buttoning my coat, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. This is the last time I'll set foot in here as anything other than a paying customer. Aaron looked up, his eyes searching mine for something. Softness, that Alvin of forgiveness. But I had nothing left to give him. At the door I turned once more. I told you before? I said quietly. I don't play by your rules. With a voicemail from Dad. I have my own. The winter air was bracing when I stepped outside, the sunlight glinting off the patches of melting snow. My breath came steady. With a voicemail from Dad, my chest light in a way it hadn't felt in months. Across the street, the bank's windows reflected the pale sky. In my bag, the documents rested, with a voicemail from Dad. Every piece of the past month's betrayal now transformed into leverage. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the car, with in front of us and the voicemail from Dad, my phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Grayson. All filings confirmed. You're in the clear. I slid the phone into my pocket, started the engine, and pulled a buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and pulled away from the curb. The road home was lined with bare trees, their branches arching overhead like a quiet guard. Justice wasn't loud today. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. It didn't need to be. It was enough that it was final. The first sign that my move had landed came the next morning. The phone didn't ring. No texts. With a voicemail from Dad. No messages left on the answering machine, its small red light dark for the first time in months. Outside, the lake was glassy under a pale sky. With a voicemail from Dad, the ice beginning to break into jagged sheets along the shore. By mid-afternoon, word had spread. At the grocery store, with a voicemail from Dad. People's eyes followed me down the aisle, their nods holding something different. Less pity, more caution. A few offered small smiles. With a voicemail from Dad. The kind that carried unspoken approval. Loretta didn't call, she didn't show up at the restaurant. With a voicemail from Dad. I heard through a neighbor that she'd been resting at home. Whether from embarrassment or strategy, I couldn't say. Voicemail from Dad. Sheryl's social media went quiet. No photos of wine glasses or dinner specials, no bright captions. Aaron's silence was the loudest. When my phone with a voicemail from Dad, I half expected him to come pounding on the door, folder in hand, demanding explanations. Instead, there was nothing. It was as if the air between us had frozen. With a voicemail from Dad, and neither of us wanted to be the first to step onto the ice. I spent the next few days sorting the house. Drawers were emptied, closets cleared. With a voicemail from Dad. Papers filed into neat stacks. The smell of cardboard and packing tape lingered in the hallway as boxes began to line the wall. It wasn't an eviction. With a voicemail from Dad? It was a choice. One afternoon, as I wrapped a set of old porcelain cups in newspaper, the phone buzzed. Tommy's name lit the screen. Hi. Buzz with a voicemail from Dad. Grandma, he said when I answered. His voice was careful but warm. Dad told me some stuff happened. That's one way to put it, I said. From Dad? I just wanted to say, I think you did the right thing. He hesitated, and I'm not picking sides. With a voicemail from Dad. I'm picking you. The air in the kitchen felt warmer. That means more than you know. I told him, can I come by before you leave? He asked, with a voicemail from Dad. Of course, I said. I'll make cinnamon rolls. When we hung up, I stood for a moment looking out at the lake. Twan buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The ice had pulled back farther from the shore, the water dark and rippling beneath the pale winter sun. The days slid into a quiet rhythm. With a voicemail from Dad. Morning coffee by the window. Sorting through decades of keepsakes. Photos, letters, a pressed flower from my wedding bouquet. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The house smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap. A clean slate in progress. On the fourth day, a certified letter arrived from Mr. Grayson. With a voicemail from Dad. All filings confirmed. My name alone on the deed. The fraud reports formally acknowledged. A neat bow tied around months of maneuvering. For the voicemail from Dad, I set the letter on the table and poured myself a cup of tea. The steam curled into the air, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I let it sit a moment before taking a sip, the heat spreading slowly through me. That evening, I built a fire in the living room. The flames moved steadily. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Not in a rush, just enough to push back the cold. I thought of Frank, not as a ghost hovering in memory, but as a part of me that had guided each choice. With a voicemail from Dad, he would have liked this ending, not loud, not messy, just done. On Sunday, Tommy came by, his boots tracked in a dusting of snow, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and his cheeks were pink from the cold. We sat in the kitchen with cinnamon rolls between us, the smell of cinnamon and sugar filling the air. Dad, where will you go? He asked. I'm thinking somewhere warmer, I said. A small place near a library, maybe by the coast. He smiled. With a voicemail. Dad, that sounds good. We talked about his classes, his friends, the things that made him laugh. And when he left, he hugged me longer than usual. After Hiafin was gone, the house was quiet again. Not empty, just quiet in a way that felt earned. On my last night at the lake house, I walked down to the dock, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The boards creaked under my boots, the water shifting softly below. The moon cast a silver path across the lake, and for a moment, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I stood there, breathing in the cold air, the smell of pine and distant wood smoke. I wasn't leaving because they'd pushed me out. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I was leaving because I had pulled myself free. When I turned back toward the house, the windows glowed warmly against the dark. Inside, the boxes were ready. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My bag by the door? Tomorrow, I'd lock the door behind me and not look back, not because there was nothing worth remembering. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but because I'd already taken the best parts with me. The ocean was the first sound I heard each morning now. It rolled in steady, unhurried waves when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. A rhythm that seemed to match my breathing. From my kitchen window, I could see the early light spilling across the water. With a voicemail from Dad. The horizon a soft line between sea and sky. Salt hung in the air, clinging faintly to my skin, and the gulls called to each other in the pale dawn. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My apartment was small rooms above a bookstore, but it was mine. Sunlight pooled on the hardwood floors in the afternoons. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and the walls had nothing I hadn't chosen. No boxes of other people's history. No reminders I hadn't invited. 3 days a week, with a voicemail from Dad. I walked down to the library, the scent of old paper and lemon polish greeting me as soon as I stepped inside. I started shelving books at first, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but it wasn't long before I had a hand in the Saturday reading group. We met in a corner near the tall windows, the ocean visible just beyond. With a voicemail from Dad, I watched people's faces soften as they spoke about the stories they loved. It was a kind of medicine, quiet but potent. On Thursdays, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I claimed a table at the cafe next door. It had creaky wooden floors and coffee strong enough to wake the most stubborn morning. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I brought a small stack of books, a jar for donations, and a hand, lettered signed. Take a story. Leave a story? At first, only a few people stopped by. Now, if I'm buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, it was rare for an hour to pass without someone settling into the chair across from me, cradling a cup of coffee, eager to talk. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the first time I saw Tommy walk through the cafe door, my heart lifted. He had driven down from the city just for the day. We sat by the window, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The scent of fresh pastries between us, and he told me about his plans. School travel, the kind of future that felt open in every direction, with a voicemail from Dad. I'm proud of you, I told him. I'm proud of you too. He said, and it wasn't just a polite echo. It was real, with a voicemail from Dad. We walked along the pier that afternoon, the boards warm under the sun, the sea breeze carrying the faint tang of fish from the harbor, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. We didn't talk about Aaron or Sheryl. We didn't need to. The past was there, but it wasn't steering the present. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, with a voicemail from Dad, I thought about the lake house, not with regret, more like holding an old photograph in my mind. It had been beautiful. It had also been a cage. With a voicemail from Dad, I'd built my life around keeping peace, even when peace meant shrinking myself. Here, I didn't have to do that. With a voicemail from Dad, the wind rattled the cafe's windows one afternoon, a storm pushing in from the ocean. Inside, the light was warm. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the smell of cinnamon drifting from the counter, I looked around at the shelves we'd filled, the worn armchair by the window, the people who came and went. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, this little corner had grown into something larger than I'd imagined. Legacy didn't have to be a will or a deed. It could be a space where people felt seen, with a voicemail from Dad, a moment of kindness someone carried with them, a quiet stand you took for yourself that rippled outward. The storm passed by evening. With a voicemail from Dad, leaving the air cool and fresh, I stepped outside, the street still wet, the lamplight reflecting in shallow puddles. The sea was darker now, with a voicemail from Dad, but its voice was steady, unchanged. I walked home slowly, the night wrapped around me like a soft coat. My key turned easily in the lock when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the door opening to the gentle scent of the sea drifting through the window I'd left cracked. I set a kettle on the stove and leaned against the counter. When my phone buzzed a voicemail from Dad, listening to it warm, my reflection in the window looked older, yes, but also lighter. The weight I'd carried of other people's greed of silence and voicemail from of erasure was gone. I poured the tea, cupping it in both hands, and stood at the window while the steam curled upward. Some endings burn, others set you free. And now, the horizon was wide open.